Very excited to be here, and thank you guys very much for having me. It's actually a huge honor. Now that I've learned about the fact that there is this mythical thing called a bacon donut somewhere in Portland, I must go find one. I'm going to spend the next very short few minutes talking about how enterprises and governments, forward-thinking ones anyway, really love to talk about the adoption of open source technologies, but in reality have been really, in my opinion, pretty slow to adopt them in most areas. So DC is no exception. We love to talk about open source. We're big fans of it, but in preparation for this specific talk, I thought it would be interesting to get a complete perspective on, the wide range of open source solutions and technologies that we use internally. And then I would come here and blow you guys away with a gigantic list of these things and prove to you how we're leading the movement in open source technology and government. So here's what I get back, though. We run Linux on a bunch of servers in our data center, maybe 20% of them. We ran a couple of software competitions called Apps for Democracy, which you might have heard of, which require every solution to be released under an open source license. We use a few tools like Eclipse, like Apache, MySQL, Subversion, things like that. But that's about it. Now, this was pretty strange to me. We've long talked in DC about how we're committed to open source and about how we're saving the government, taxpayers' money, how we require agencies to consider open source technologies when they want to buy something proprietary. But it turns out that this is mostly talk. And the more I thought about this, the more I actually thought this made a little bit of sense, and that I think I understand why. To explain this, first, a bit of background. As the centralized technology agency for the entire district government, my agency is responsible for all IT spend across the government. Now, one of the ways that we ensure that this money is spent well is that for every technology procurement an agency wants to make, we require them to fill out what's called an electronic project initiation form. And the idea there is that that form contains all kinds of details about that project, what it's about, what the business case is, what the success criteria, and more importantly, what alternatives they've considered and why they might have rejected those alternatives in favor of something else. And one of the required fields there is then, what open source solutions have you considered? Now, more often than not, it turns out that this field is actually ignored, and we've just been letting it slip through for a couple of years now since we had this thing in place. Now, initially, I thought it was a bad thing. But strangely, the more I think about this and the more people I discuss this with, I actually think it might not be so bad. And the reason for this is that I actually think that if we mandated that open source solutions, when available, needed to be implemented, many of these implementations would actually end up failing. So those are fighting words, I know. But there is actually a good reason for this. I think a top-down mandate to require open source solutions isn't going to work, or will rarely work, precisely because it's the top of the organization. It's not the top of the organization that needs to embrace those solutions, right? In order for an open source solution to actually be implemented well and generate value, the people who are actually doing the selecting and the implementation need to believe not only in the value of the implementation based on open standards, but also need to have the creativity and mindset required to implement something which doesn't actually have a specific blueprint or necessarily have a specific blueprint associated with it. Proprietary solutions, as we all know, for the most part, come with a script or a plan that theoretically just needs to be tweaked in order to be implemented for any given organization. Open source solutions, on the other hand, are generally much less rigid in terms of documentation and require all of the implementation teams to really think very carefully about how a particular solution really should be designed in order to satisfy the organization's requirements across all of the timeframes that that solution will live through. So that's the main kind of concept here. There are several other issues as well. I don't have a lot of time to get into them, but I just want to touch on them really quickly. Number one is procurement. We need to address procurement issues for open source and government. It's not necessarily easy, given the licensing agreements that exist today, for a government to actually take in an open source solution and utilize that effectively. Number two, we need to address support concerns. This should come as no surprise to anybody in the room. Just as an example, if my HR system goes down, I pick up the phone, the black helicopters fly in, troops rappel from the helicopters into my windows and fix my problem. But if I build a website on an open source stack and it crashes, who do I call? Now, I can sign up for support contracts with various organizations out there, but this is an important thing to keep in mind as new open source projects come up that should be implemented within the walls of government, and any organization for that matter. And then finally, I think we need to address the issue of cost from a much more honest perspective. People in my position in organizations and governments across the world, I think, have this fundamental belief that simply by implementing open source solutions, you're going to save 80% over a proprietary solution. And frankly, that's just not true. If you want the solution to work well, you still have to invest in it. You might not invest in upfront license costs, but what you will invest in is the people and the skills that are required to actually implement a piece of software well and then maintain it over time. So while the cost is not going to be the 100% of the proprietary solution, in fact, it might be anywhere from 60 to 80%, there still is an associated cost, but there still are savings. So these are kind of the bad news items, but I think they're all things that a lot of smart people out there that I've talked to recently are thinking about. So things are heading in a good track. But we also have what I think are some really amazing examples in DC right now that we're working on and that are really providing, I think, an interesting roadmap and pointing us in the right direction that we're personally learning a lot from. So just a few quick examples. Number one, we're currently implementing JBoss as our integration solution in lieu of a proprietary solution which we've had in place for literally the last 10 years. It turns out that this is one of those no-brainer decisions for us, and it really flowed from some of the earlier statements I made. The team that was responsible for maintaining this proprietary solution and is currently doing the JBoss implementation actually spent a long time researching available options, both proprietary and open source, and after careful consideration settled on the JBoss solution as the right one. Now, this wasn't just because of the cost argument, although that did play a factor. Like many local governments right now, our budgets are very tight, so wherever we can save money, we're trying to do so. But the real reason was because it actually met their main requirements of support for industry standards and best practices, and also the prevention of future dependencies and vendor lock-in. So it was the right choice. But the best part, and the reason why this implementation is going to be a massive success, is that the decision came from the team. I gave them the ability to take a look at any of the solutions that existed out there. They took that freedom and settled on something that they believed in and that they know is going to do the right thing. And so I'm confident that this is going to be a success. Now, this is one of actually my favorite new DC initiatives, and it's actually sort of the reason that I'm up here in the first place after a conversation I had with Tim. But this one starts with a story. In 2000, like pretty much probably everybody in this room, I watched with some amount of horror as the election debacle unfolded in Florida. Now, that problem was actually based on paper ballots, as we all know, but there were plenty of issues during that election with proprietary, unauditable electronic voting systems and voting hardware. So it struck me in 2000 that the solution to this problem was actually an open source solution, because this really isn't necessarily just the answer to it. It really is just the basic concept for an open and transparent democratic process. So now fast forward to last year, to 2009, when I became the CTO of DC. I work for the mayor, so everything out in the open. I'm not allowed to participate in any kind of electoral process for obvious reasons, but I can make introductions. And so as our Board of Election and Ethics began searching for solutions for the 2010 electoral season, I actually introduced them to an organization called the Open Source Digital Voting Foundation, which is partly headquartered here in Portland. And one thing led to another, and DC, and this is huge, I'm really proud to be able to say this, DC is now, to my knowledge, the first jurisdiction ever to be piloting an open source solution to allow military and overseas voters to cast their ballots in a way that is just as secure as any existing solutions. This is huge. I'm not going to say too much more. Greg Miller, who's one of the co-founders of the organization, is actually here today, and he will be speaking at a panel on Friday. So I encourage you guys to go and check out what they're doing. Participate in that project. It's incredibly important for everything, and he's going to be, on his panel, going to be talking about a lot of these issues. Finally, and this is one of the projects I think that I'm most excited about. We talked about Code for America a little bit with Jen and with Tim, but I want to talk just very, very briefly about the Code for America project that DC is doing. I'm not going to say too much. This is just a tease, because at, I think, 11:30 today, we've got a session, a panel session, which I hope actually will be very interactive and lots of questions and answers. But basically, in a nutshell, what we're going to be doing is creating a non-jurisdictional organization, which is designed not only to ingest all of these amazing projects that jurisdictions like DC and other jurisdictions around the world have done, but also individuals, but also to create the required foundational frameworks that make it easy for governments to actually adopt these things. So a legal framework, a marketing framework. That's actually incredibly important. How do you sell somebody on on a solution that's open source? We need that component. On documentation, to create a foundation for support. So anyway, these are all things that we're doing. The grand vision here is to essentially create the civic stack of software that any jurisdiction in the world can literally take from and automatically be interoperable with everybody else. So my ask of you guys with this is to come and participate in that session. Participate in the project, because it's going to take all of you and everything that you guys are good at doing to make this thing a success. My job is to get governments involved. Your job is to get people like you sitting here today involved. Anyway, thank you guys very much for the time. I really appreciate it.